Hello and welcome to this talk about the intimacy of anger with myself, Adam Wilder and Roger Jackson. We're going to be talking today a bit about the purpose of anger, what happens when we don't express our anger, and we're going to look at the link between anger and violence. And finally, we're going to explore a bit around how can we express our anger in a healthy way. But first, let me introduce our guest, Roger Jackson. And hello, Roger.
Hi, Adam. Good to see you.
Great to see you, Roger. I'd like to introduce you a bit first to the audience. So Roger is a trauma therapist, a massage therapist, a group facilitator, and international teacher. He's certified in somatic experiencing, Esalen massage, and other bodywork styles, and is trained as an Iyengar yoga instructor. Roger's been working for a therapist for 15 years, and in 2013 he became the director of the massage school Oasis in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and has been a faculty member of Spacio in Spain since 2014. So welcome, Roger. Are you ready to get stuck into the anger today?
I am. Yeah, looking forward to it.
Great. So let's start with from the perspective of trauma and human beings. What is the purpose of anger? Why do we get angry? Because all the spiritual schools are saying, you mustn't get angry. So why do we have anger?
That's a good question. And I'm not sure what spiritual schools are saying don't get angry. But I'm intrigued to know which ones are saying that. I think anger on one level is just a basic way of responding and defending ourselves. I think it's part of a recognition of that which doesn't feel right to me and that which I don't really want happening in my life or somehow need to change. And anger is part of the expression of that. It's part of what gives me the ability to set limits, and the ability to actually say no to somebody. So I think anger is such an important part of our makeup, and yet for so many reasons it's so hard for us to touch into. It's kind of been socialized out of us on many levels. It has a real stigma about being angry. So I think it's kind of one of these emotions that has a very negative rap, unfortunately.
It's not, I feel uncomfortable if I'm walking down the street and someone's shouting or being aggressive. It feels uncomfortable to me and my sense is to move away from it. And anger, for me, helps me to know when something doesn't feel right, when it feels like someone's messing with me in a way that I don't want to be messed with. And it's an indicator that something is not quite right, essentially.
Yeah, I think you touched on it nicely, that desire of wanting to move away from it. There's a certain comfortable and uncomfortable register that we have, that we tend to want to feel good, we want to feel happy, we want to feel safe, we want to feel comfortable. And unfortunately, anger often doesn't feel like those things are part of it. So, it's very common that anger and a lack of safety come together. And so we naturally move away from it. And of all of the emotions, anger for me is just one to touch into. It was very much socialized out of me in terms of being the good boy. And I see this again and again in therapy sessions. It's just this idea of, I didn't realize I was allowed to be angry. And so rather than actually the healthier expression of that, it just kind of gets pushed in and we start looking for alternative ways to deal with it. I've actually seen a message from somebody online, Ingrid May, and she's always been very good at getting angry. She was one of the first people that helped me learn to get angry.
Let's move on in a moment to what happens when we don't express our anger. But this cultural shame around anger is very interesting because we know it's a function that tells us something isn't quite right. And then something gets lost in between this noticing this sensation and being able to express it in a healthy way. And I've done for me. What happens is there's this fear that if I really let loose, I don't know what's going to happen.
Mm,
It's like opening Pandora's box. Um,
mm.
so there are some wonderful, wonderful ways of expressing anger in a healthy way, which hopefully we're going to come to at the end. But I wonder if that's familiar with you and your clients as well. This feeling of if I allow myself to feel it, then where could it get to?
Yeah. It's not so much familiar for me, that specific feeling, but it's definitely resonates with a lot of what I hear from clients.
Mm,
And I think what happens is it has to do with the amount of times that we've actually repressed that anger. So the amount of times we have felt anger for whatever reason, we haven't said it, and that anger has effectively built up in our body as potential charge. So when so let's say a period of time passes and I feel anger again, I'm not only feeling the anger of the moment of whatever's happening, I'm also feeling that pent up anger from beforehand.
mm,
So if I have various of these stories, as a lot of people do, then I'm just getting progressively more and more potential anger build up inside me. So that when I do actually express something, what comes out has no kind of resonance to the kind of response that was necessary. So, very simple examples, and I think of this as people drowning in a cup of water, that kind of concept. So, let's say someone drops a glass and the glass breaks, and somebody who's been holding in lots of anger for a long time suddenly just explodes in a way that has no bearing on the importance of losing a glass that maybe cost a couple of pounds.
mm,
So I think this is really common, that the more and more we hold it in, the harder it gets to express anything, because we feel like what we're going to express is just going to be, the end of the world. We're going to become kind of crazed Godzilla and destroy everybody. Um, and I think
mm,
it's really important because of that to start finding, first of all, ways to start expressing that which hasn't been expressed in the past.
mm.
But it's kind of just clearing out the old, so that when we do get anger that's coming, it's more relevant to the moment, and so it's easier to deal with.
A
Um,
kind of a cleaner sense of anger rather than 40 years of pent up rage. In fact, the Joker is quite about this, about someone who doesn't feel like they can express their anger, and he builds up this hatred and resentment, and it explodes in this quite dark way. And I think that's a fascinating look at what can happen when we repress anger. I want to mention one of our colleagues, Roma Norris, who
mm,
teaches hand-in-hand parenting, and she talks about when a child is not allowed to have a cookie and they're crying and screaming and going to a tantrum. It's not about the cookie, it's about all those times in the park when they couldn't express their anger. So in her school of parenting, it's all about allowing the child to express the emotion, like you say, to get it out, so that when new anger comes up, it can be expressed very cleanly and clearly. And for me, when anger is expressed cleanly and without blame and judgment, it can actually be a big invitation to a deeper state of intimacy and understanding with
mm,
someone. Let's
that's
let's
good.
move on a bit more to what happens when we don't express it.
Mm. Yeah, it's a good question, and there's not one answer either. But I think, I mean, the obvious answer is that we repress it. But then what does that mean? So on the one hand, we might get the kind of build up that we were just talking about. But a very common experience is just the inability to make contact with anger. It
Mm,
just disappears effectively. So what it's done, it's been frozen out of the possibilities of response, or socialized out often. It's just repetitively hearing, you should be a good boy, don't be a bad boy, and the association of anger with the bad boy. And so
mm.
instantly, each time I get angry, I'm told that it's the bad response, and so it slowly gets socialized out of us. Um,
And even more so perhaps for women, because it can be seen as disagreeable to be angry, for example.
yeah, I think there's quite a lot of studies that confirm that. that suggest that men connect more easily to anger and women connect more easily to sadness. Obviously, not doesn't mean that includes everybody, but there are just tendencies. But I think it's very common for men and women to not be able to make contact with anger, and so there's often absolutely no there's no inner recognition that I am angry or that I need to express anger. It's kind of because that anger has just been associated with impotence. I can give you an example to make this more understanding. Let's say someone grows up with an angry father, and whenever they get angry, whenever the child gets angry, the father gets even angrier. And so it just kind of flattens out the possibility of experiencing that anger. And so this happening, the experience just becomes angry. Well, there's no point feeling angry because it'll just make everything worse and I'll lose out. So it starts just coupling this anger with a feeling of impotence. And so after a while, we just stop connecting it. And as soon as we start feeling anger, we just collapse down into this state of impotence and this feeling of I'm not going to be able to. And, lots of negative thought patterns tend to arise from that.
And we know that we need this anger as this basic defense mechanism to say, actually, it's not okay that you take all my food or, whatever it is. We need this anger. In some studies that I've looked at, anger is linked a lot to passion as well, and can be linked to sexuality. So that if you find it hard to get angry, you might also find it quite hard to feel passionate and cultivate a sexual charge. And it's quite interesting to me how those are linked. And it comes back to this idea that to be healthy and whole, we want to cultivate emotional fluency so that we can develop a sense of comfort in our emotions and not freak out when they come up. That's
interesting. I hadn't really thought about that before, but just listening to you, I immediately associate this with the functioning of like the mobilization response. So, the classic fight-flight state. Now, the fight-flight state comes on when we're in an insecure state. So, for example, if I feel unsafe and I get an anger response, but the mobilization response when we're feeling safe is what mobilizes our body, and it allows us to work effectively and quickly. It allows us to play sports. It allows us to move, to mobilize. And it's a massive part of sex as well, and passion. Now, I'd never really thought about it very much, but I think that makes total sense. If I effectively rule out any kind of expression of anger, that there's part of that, the functioning of that whole system, both on the negative and what's deemed the more negative and what's deemed the more positive or the safer side, is all going to get just frozen down, just kind of locked down. So yeah, I think that's quite an interesting insight. And just tying it back to my own life, I definitely recognize that if I don't express anger, then there is a passion that gets lost. That feels so real to me. That feels so real to me. And especially the person with whom that is occurring, if that anger is not expressed, it's like there's part of me that isn't showing up. So there is a limiting to the relationship and where that relationship can go. And I think that's huge.
Agreed that the healthy expression of anger is an essential part of a relationship. I think the healthy expression, and let's move on to that in a moment. Perhaps we could talk about the link between anger and violence. What would you say the relationship between, how does this work?
On one level, I think it's probably a very complex question that probably deserves way more time than we're going to give it. And
Roger,
it's probably been studied.
3 bullet points and we're done,
I'm sure that there are people who have studied it extensively, and we're going to just leave a very poor version in comparison. But I think of anger as something that is in and of its own right, something which is healthy that be expressed.
Mm.
And I think of violence as being the point where the expression of that anger steps into the sovereignty of another person in
Mm.
some kind of negative way. Now, whether that be on an individual level, on a state level, somehow there's a stepping into the safety, the just the sovereignty of the other person. So whether I'm then infringing upon their rights, removing their rights, I'm causing physical harm. And I think this difference between what I would call healthy expression of anger and violence, it's also part of the fear of expression, this idea that it's the same thing. So a lot of people think, oh, I can't express anger because that's violent and I don't want to be a violent person, which, as most good people will think, most sane people think. But we need to express anger. It's part of how we bargain, how we set limits, how we create space. So I think the violence is when we start infringing upon the rights and the sovereignty of other people or other institutions or other states, however that might manifest.
Thanks, Roger. Yeah, I like what you were saying there, between the difference between the healthy expression and then when it comes over into leaning into someone else's domain and causing action or harm in someone else. And to come back to the idea that actually anger is a part of our emotional makeup. There's a reason that we have it. We can learn to express it in a healthy way, because if we don't, it can come out in other ways. It can build up and feel overwhelming and all encompassing.
Yeah.
So let's talk a bit. Yeah.
And I think it also just feels very refreshing. It feels very alive. When we actually express a bit of anger, it often just wakes up the whole situation. It gets things moving. It gets us awakened again, rather than dropping down into this kind of apathetic state where we're not really connecting with ourselves or with the other person. There's a real lack of aliveness in that on an individual level, which is just not very nice. That's the simplest way of saying it. And sometimes, and this has been a real journey for me over the past couple of years, because as I said earlier, anger was very hard for me. And so one of the things that I've noticed is that often I would notice the fear of expressing anger. When I actually expressed it, what happened was massively different than what happened in my imagined fear state. So what I was projecting onto the situation. And I see this happening for so many people, that as soon as they get to express it, it suddenly kind of breathes life into the situation, into the relationship, it ignited into this kind of frozen down state. Yeah.
I've absolutely noticed that the fear of expressing anger is a lot bigger than the impact than it has in certain situations. And I found that by expressing anger in a healthy way, it can invite people into this deeper state of authenticity, to actually understand each other better and what's going on. And I like how you say breathe life, because that's what it feels like, just warming up, breathing life. And when it's not expressed, I've noticed this, it's like a heavy, damp cloak to walk around under, in this relationship with this person or this situation. And it can color everything and create so much resentment. So I would say it is better to say, actually, look, I feel really angry about this. This doesn't feel okay with me. And without blame, without attack, but a healthy or authentic expression, like you say, can bring life and vitality and actually help to resolve situations. Yeah. So let's talk about how we can express anger in a healthy way and not go into this crazy mode.
Yeah, I think there's lots of modalities of this, and there's lots of work done on this as well. But I think the simplest version just has to do with expressing what is happening for us, and and the biggest red flag is to start talking about the other person and
Mm-hmm.
what they do.
Mm-hmm.
So, let's say something has really pissed you off and you're not feeling happy about it at all. Rather than, there's definitely a tendency for the lights and the attention to all go out to the other person and the finger to be pointed. And what does that do? It trigger in the other person the exact kind of same mobilization response. They get angry as well. And so suddenly one anger response creates another anger response, and we lose the ability to hear each other. And we just get in this vicious cycle of just responding from this adrenaline infused reactivity. Now, the better version that I know is just expressing how I feel. So if that is, I feel really angry, it's literally saying those words. It starts with I statements. It starts with I feel really angry. I feel really upset. I notice that I feel tension in my body. And this was one of the best paths for me to reawaken my ability to experience anger. And that was through the body. So I would start to notice things in my body. So I would notice, for example, my shoulders felt a bit tight. I'm exaggerating slightly, but they'd be kind of, my hands would be more tending towards clenched. My jaw would be tight. Eyebrows furrowed. How are you? I'm fine.
Very
just, yeah, exactly. You could say that. But to be honest, I noticed that this happens around the whole world as well, everywhere I go. But it was by starting to name these things that I started to be able to contact my own anger. I'd start saying, I feel like my stomach is closed, like I feel like my forehead is really tight, my fists feel hard. I was like, oh, this is anger. Yeah, I feel angry. And it was only by recognizing it in my body that I was able to reawaken anger in myself. I still feel like I'm learning to reawaken it.
I really like that, because when we're simply observing sensations in our body, it's like we have permission to do that in our we're allowed to say, oh, I notice I'm feeling uncomfortable, and I feel, like you say, I feel this tension in my shoulder. And whoever you're with can hopefully relate to that. And it builds more connection and contact. So if you do say, oh, I'm feeling really angry about this, it's different from blaming the other person. I'm really angry with you because you did this to me, and maybe there's a time.
Tempting, though.
Sorry, Roger.
It's always tempting, though.
Oh yeah.
It's always tempting to just. It's so much easier to have to take any responsibility for how I am, what I haven't said beforehand, the things that I wasn't clear about, how I didn't set my boundaries well. It's so much easier to just wave the finger at the other person. But when I start speaking about myself, I immediately bring my own responsibility into it. And I think that's part of what makes it so different to hear. It's so different it's so different hearing, hey, Adam, I'm feeling really angry, to I'm so angry with you.
Yeah.
It's so different. It's so different. The whole experience changes in terms of how we can be receptive to that.
So could we talk about a few techniques that people can use to express anger in a healthy way? I'd like to talk about the example of a friend who had terribly bad eczema for years and years, and tried everything. And this eczema was so bad that he would wake up with, the sheets covered in little flecks of blood and stuff, like really awful. I think he spent 2 years on a very intense diet where he felt socially very disconnected from everyone because he couldn't have any food with them. And eventually someone suggested, oh, you're really angry. You need to go out and cycle in the countryside and scream your head off. And he did that. And after a couple of weeks, his eczema pretty much totally cleared up, and he still has the occasional outbreak, but he's a big convert to anger therapy now. And I'm reminded of the film Cabaret, when Liza Minnelli goes underneath a bridge. When a train passes, she screams her head off because it's the only safe place to express anger. So how can we healthily express our anger in this day and age without the police coming, without people freaking out, without freaking ourselves out?
Yeah. I think there's lots of ways we can do it. And I think the most important way is that it needs to feel safe. It needs to feel safe enough that we can kind of stay on top of it, still feel like ourselves. And I think there's lots of methods. And I think we can start with the simplest things, just like journaling, just writing about the things that have really made us angry, so that we can start just getting a little bit of that charge out and helping us to really understand cognitively what happened with it. I think that can help. And then, I think the example of going out shouting, if you can find a good context for it, then it can be brilliant. I wouldn't recommend going out onto Oxford Street doing it. But if you can find somewhere natural, somewhere where there's not so many people, somewhere where you're not going to make other people scared in the process, then great. And I also find that even the power of our imagination is amazingly useful for this. So I'll often use and recommend to other people that they allow themselves to imagine themselves getting really angry. And, well, if you were, no, I can't get angry. Well, if you were to get angry, what would it look like? Can you imagine it? And so just, we can even imagine ourselves with one of these boxing bags and just punching and getting elbows, really, really just connecting to that very, very primitive sympathetic mobilization energy. So I think that can really help as well. The example that I gave you, for me, it was about starting to notice it in my body, starting to recognize, oh, hang on, all of this is, these what do these clenched fists mean? And so suddenly it became very obvious, like, oh yeah, this is anger, okay. So I think getting in touch with just noticing what's happening in the body is a great way of checking in and starting to recognize that there is anger that needs to be expressed. What I would definitely recommend is finding how I started, finding a way that it feels safe. So, for example, I had a session with someone not so long ago who were connected to anger in a really nice way. But one of the not so positive things is that we hadn't grounded him enough after the session. And so then there was a lot of anger still going on. He found himself getting in arguments with people during the week. So we have to make sure that we just do enough of it in a safe context, and that anger is being channeled where it's healthy, and we're not suddenly channeling it out onto family members or our partners or, whoever we have close.
That's such a good point, because also, as we've been saying, it's not culturally done to express anger so much. So we've got this big reservoir of it, and we don't want to just unleash the dam and let it gush everywhere. We want to titrate it and let it out slowly. Yeah. I'm a big fan of physical exercises with anger. So there's one even about screaming into a pillow. Yeah. So if you're not out there in nature, you can still take a pillow and just shout into it and scream and swear. And what I like about it is this permission to express things you're not normally allowed to express. But here it's a safe space. You're allowed to just scream and shout. Yeah. I quite like trying to push against a tree, try and do something that's physically impossible. Try and push over a big oak tree, for example, and just push and push and push. I quite like it until it's exhausted. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, a great version of that, and we're really taking it out on pillows today, but it's just this squeezing into a pillow. I mean, we can do it. I've got a pillow here, but this thing of just in slow motion squeezing very gently, very slow motion with all the hands, with the forearms, with the arms, with the shoulders, with the jaw. Just really squeeze in and then release it. And what we're doing is we're activating that sympathetic fight flight response, and it will often just drain away so much of that energy. It's giving it a response. It's giving it a way of coming out of the body. It's very common after that to just start feeling a lot more gentle. That can also relieve waves of emotion can come out after that. I think sadness can come up from moments when we didn't express it and it just stayed in the body. So, I mean, this is a great method, and just, really tightening and feeling our own power is a great thing to do as well in relationship to this. But I think finding ways of connecting anger with our potency and starting to disconnect this idea that I brought up before of, when anger comes up, I start feeling impotent. I feel like I don't have a response. I don't have power with it. So these kind of things like, pushing against the tree or squeezing a cushion, the different methods that we can use that actually give us that raw physical feeling of feeling of power connected with the anger.
There's something very sovereign about it, because with this anger, it's like I'm saying, I matter. I actually matter. I stand for myself and I matter. And that's what I think is so beautiful about it. And I think it's so important that we have that we have a healthy relationship of feeling that I'm angry because I matter. It's beautiful. Well, Roger, I think it's time to finish up now. So thanks for watching. Roger and I are doing a workshop on the intimacy of anger to commemorate Armistice Day on the 11th of November. So the link is in the chat here in the description. So do join us for that. And I'm running a boundaries lab, which I will post in the chat here. And Roger, would you like to put your links for your therapy work?
Yeah, sure. I will do that.
Thank you. The link between boundaries and anger is very, very interesting. I've just put the link in there. It's for a free embodied boundaries lab, which is an introduction to a longer course. And thanks for watching, Megan, Tim, and Morgan from the US. Great to see you tuned in there. Rog, you putting your link in?
I thought I had, but I clearly haven't.
I can't see it.
Maybe you put it in for me, because I'm not entirely sure where it's supposed to go right now.
Okay, yeah, I'll put it in the chat there.
Great, thank you.
Great. Well, thanks for your time today, and thanks everyone for watching. This was the first talk. We're doing a series of talks. The next one, I think, is about using gibberish as a mind-clearing technique, which again is a bit like this, expressing the anger, expressing things you can't usually say. Well, imagine all that stuff in your monkey mind and having permission to just express it. And the first part is in that expression. The second part is peace and silence. Okay, thanks very much, everyone, for watching, and hope to see you soon. Thanks, Roger.
Absolute pleasure.
Cheers. Bye.